You know the story of Noah's Ark, right? I mean, it's one of the most famous stories ever told. We've all seen the pictures, the movies. But if we peel back the layers of this ancient tale, what did really happen? Let's dig in. The basics are pretty familiar to all of us. The world is wicked, so God decides to hit the reset button. He finds one good guy, Noah, and gives him this monumental task: build a gigantic boat. Then he's got to gather up his family and a pair of every animal before a flood comes to wipe the slate clean.
And really, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is this story an actual historical account? So for today's explainer, we're going to approach this like an investigation. We'll look at the evidence, piece by piece, and try to figure out what this story is truly telling us.
So let's start with Exhibit A, the Ark itself. And you can just forget about that cute little bathtub-shaped boat you see in storybooks. The vessel described in the text is, well, it's an absolute beast of a ship, an engineering marvel, or maybe an engineering impossibility. The original text is super specific about the dimensions, but what on earth is a cubit? Well, it was an ancient unit of measurement, and it's roughly the length from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. So what does that actually look like in today's terms? Let's do the math. We're talking about a wooden ship that's around 450 feet long. To put that into perspective, that's 1.5 American football fields from end to end. This thing would have been, by a huge margin, the largest wooden ship ever built in history. And a ship that big creates some pretty serious problems. First off, just holding it together. The biggest wooden ships ever actually built were only about 300 feet long, and even they had huge problems with leaking and basically breaking apart in rough seas. Now imagine a 450-foot wooden boat in a world-ending storm. Then you've got to think about building it, getting enough air for all those animals to breathe, and, the unbelievable amount of poop they'd all be creating every single day. Okay, so the boat itself is a huge question mark. Let's move on to our next piece of evidence, Exhibit B, the cargo. We're not just talking about a few cows and chickens here. The instruction was to bring 2 of every kind of living thing. So let's talk about scale. Today, scientists figure there are something like 8.7 million different species on the planet. And that's not even counting all the species that have gone extinct. Now, even if kind means something broader than species, we are still talking about an absolutely staggering number of animals.
So the big question is, could they even fit? This chart really puts it into perspective. You can see the estimated size of the Ark, and then you see the space you'd actually need for all those animals. And then, look at the space you'd need for all their food and water for a whole year. It just doesn't add up. And it goes way beyond just pure space. Just think about the logistics for a second. How exactly do you get kangaroos from Australia and polar bears from the Arctic? How do you keep the lions from, eating the lambs? What do you feed a panda that only eats a specific kind of bamboo? It's a logistical puzzle on a scale that is just mind-boggling.
All right, for our last exhibit, let's zoom out. Let's look at the main event itself, the flood. An event that big, a global flood that covers the entire planet. You'd think it would leave a pretty big mark, a scar on the face of the earth. So the question is, can we find it?
And here, we kind of run into 2 completely different stories. On one hand, you have the biblical account, a single, massive flood that covers everything, even the highest mountains. But on the other hand, when geologists look at the Earth's rock layers, they see a different story. They see billions of years of history, with zero evidence of a single flood that covered the whole planet all at once. What they do see is evidence for lots of huge but regional floods. So, when you look to the Earth itself for clues, the scientific consensus is pretty clear. The evidence for a single global flood of that magnitude simply isn't in the geological record.
So if the engineering seems impossible, the animal logistics are a nightmare, and the geological evidence isn't there, our investigation has to ask a new question. If the story of Noah isn't a literal historical event, then what is it?
This brings us to a really fascinating idea called the flood myth. It turns out stories about a giant, world-destroying flood are not unique to this one story, not at all. You can find them in ancient cultures from all over the globe.
In fact, if you look at the timeline, you find stories that are incredibly similar to Noah's, but they're much, much older. The most famous one is the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia. It was written down more than 1,000 years before the Genesis account, and guess what? It's got a divine warning, a giant boat, and a hero who saves animals from a flood that ends the world.
And the similarities are just uncanny. It's not just a vague flood story. We're talking a warning from a god,
A command to build a big boat, saving family and animals, the boat landing on a mountain, even the little detail of sending out birds to find dry land. It's all there. This strongly suggests that the story of Noah is part of a much older, shared tradition of storytelling in the ancient world.
Which brings us to our final, and maybe most important question. If this story isn't a literal blueprint of what happened in the past, what kind of timeless blueprint is it? Maybe its real power isn't about physics or biology, but about what it says about us, about faith, hope, and getting a second chance.